We generally walk around with this assumption about the world's most elite, highly funded institutions. We think of them as these relentless, perfectly tuned engines of truth. I mean, it makes sense, right? When billions of dollars or even human lives are on the line, surely these incredibly smart people are looking reality dead in the eye. Well, what if they aren't? What if they are actually engineered from the ground up to do the exact opposite? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to slowly unpack a deeply unsettling, frankly terrifying philosophy based on the work of evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers. We're going to explore how the smartest, most resourced groups of people on the planet actively, deliberately, and systematically destroy the truth. And why do they do it? Simply to protect their own internal prestige and image. It is a slow, methodical refusal to know.
Right, let's really dive into this, because it is a profoundly counterintuitive idea. Trivers presents us with this fascinating biological paradox. Think about it. Human beings possess these absolutely marvelous, highly evolved sense organs. Our eyes, our ears, our neural processing. It's all designed by millions of years of evolution to give us a remarkably accurate, high-definition view of the outside world. And from a pure survival standpoint, perceiving reality accurately is exactly what should keep us alive. You need to see the predator to run from the predator, right? Yet, as Trivers points out, something bizarre happens. Once this pristine, accurate information arrives in our brains, we almost immediately begin to distort it. We bias it. We destroy it. We literally gather the truth and then we actively choose blindness. Which begs a massive, uncompromising question. Why on earth would natural selection favor a mind that constantly lies to itself?
To answer that, we have to completely reframe how we view self-deception. Normally, we think of lying to ourselves as this soft, defensive mechanism. Something we do just to feel a little better, to soothe our bruised egos. But Trivers argues something much more aggressive and, honestly, much darker. So the crucial point here is this. Self-deception evolved as an offensive weapon. We deceive ourselves, the better to deceive others. Just think about the mechanics of lying for a second. Lying to someone else takes a massive amount of mental energy. It carries a huge cognitive load. You have to constantly invent the lie, you have to remember the actual truth so you don't trip up, and you have to suppress all your physical tells. It's exhausting. But if you can bury that truth deep, deep down in your own unconscious mind, well, then you actually believe your own lie. You become the perfect, completely undetectable deceiver. And when this mechanism scales up, when this happens not just inside one person's head, but across an entire organization, the results are absolutely catastrophic.
Section 1. The cockpit's shared illusion. To truly grasp how fatal this can be, let's bring this down to a micro level. Imagine the claustrophobic, incredibly high-stakes confines of a doomed aircraft cockpit. In this space, the active refusal to see reality isn't just a slow, bureaucratic failure. It's immediately fatal. Take the tragic case of Air Florida Flight 90 in 1982. The plane is sitting on the runway in Washington, D.C., right in the middle of a blinding snowstorm. Outside the window, you have unforgiving, brutal reality. Severe ice is actively building up on the wings, and they are getting terrifyingly anomalous instrument readings as they start their takeoff roll. That's the reality. But inside the pilot's mind, he is rapidly constructing a completely manufactured illusion of safety. The black box cockpit voice recordings of this are absolutely haunting to listen to. As the plane accelerates down the runway, the co-pilot repeatedly reads out the terrifying instrument anomalies. He is looking right at the truth. But the pilot, driven by a deep need to protect his confidence, his authority, his image of being in control, he rationalizes every single warning away. He acts as a literal agent of denial. And because of the power dynamic in that tiny room, the co-pilot eventually stops fighting. He surrenders. He becomes trapped in the pilot's shared illusion right up until the exact moment the plane slams into a bridge and plunges into the freezing Potomac River. Now, what happens when that exact kind of deadly denial scales up from a two-person cockpit to a massive institution? Consider Egypt Air Flight 990, which plummeted into the Atlantic Ocean in 1999. Following the crash, the evidence uncovered by the NTSB was highly specific and devastating. The cockpit recordings and the flight data proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that a relief co-pilot had deliberately taken control of the aircraft and crashed it in a tragic act of suicide. But think about what that truth meant for the airline, and by extension, the Egyptian state. Accepting that truth meant accepting a catastrophic, highly public collapse of their institutional prestige. A suicidal pilot completely destroys the image of safety and control. So what did they do? Instead of accepting the NTSB's undeniable physical evidence, the state manufactured a completely alternate reality. They generated these incredibly sophisticated, downright bizarre conspiracy theories. They blamed small hidden bombs. They blamed Israeli agents secretly targeting generals who happened to be on board. They actively, aggressively built a false narrative because looking at the brutal, systemic truth was simply too costly for their image.
Section 2. NASA refusing to know. If we scale up even further, moving from the airline industry into the sprawling, deeply complex labyrinth of a federal space agency, we see this exact same architecture of denial at play. Let's apply Trevor's uncompromising framework to NASA's darkest hours. Think back to the 1986 Challenger disaster. We have to ask ourselves, how does an agency completely filled with literal rocket scientists launch a ship they were explicitly warned might explode? Well, Trivers points out that the shuttle program was incredibly expensive. It was constantly under pressure, constantly needing to justify its own existence to secure that vital funding from Congress. NASA had to sell an image. They were selling the idea of routine, cost-effective spaceflight, and because the entire organization was so deeply committed to this sales pitch, physical reality suddenly became a massive inconvenience. When lower-level engineers frantically raised alarms about those fragile O-rings failing in cold weather, NASA didn't hit the brakes. Instead, their own safety departments literally mutated. Rather than studying the flaws carefully, the safety unit became an agent of rationalization. They took these fatal, undeniable flaws and simply redefined them on paper as an acceptable safety factor.
And this deeply engineered ignorance, it didn't stop there. It built into something even more shocking 17 years later during the Columbia disaster in 2003. Let's walk through this timeline slowly because it is chilling. On day 1 of the mission, right during takeoff, a massive piece of foam breaks off and strikes the shuttle's bipod ramp. By day 2, the lower-level engineers are reviewing the launch footage, and they are terrified by what they see. They are so concerned that they actually bypass standard protocol. They go directly to the Department of Defense and ask them to point their high-resolution spy satellites at the shuttle so they can actually see the extent of the damage. They are actively trying to seek the truth. But then, day 3 arrives. Higher management steps in. A manager literally asks her superiors a question that perfectly captures this entire philosophy. She asks if they want to know what the satellites might show. And their response? No. They actively, deliberately cancel the request, citing improper channels.
I really want you to just sit with that for a moment. Let it sink in. Why would a space agency dedicated to scientific truth actively refuse to look at high-resolution images of its own damaged ship with its own astronauts currently trapped inside? Under Trivers' framework, the answer is brutally, uncompromisingly clear. They did it because seeing the truth would force them to take an action that would completely destroy their institutional prestige. It would ruin their carefully planned flight schedules, and it would shatter their projected narrative of total control. They engineered their own ignorance. Faced with a choice, they vastly preferred the warm comfort of the illusion over the incredibly heavy, terrifying burden of the truth.
Section 3. Walling off geopolitical truth.
Now, this deliberate blindness isn't just restricted to planes and spaceships. Let's zoom out again, all the way out to the geopolitical theater. We're talking about the level of nation-states, where this exact same institutional refusal to know can ignite global devastation. Trivers uses the preparation for the 2003 Iraq War as essentially a textbook example of massive geopolitical self-deception. The leaders involved on the war very rapidly, with an absolute minimum of true deliberation. Now, to prepare, the government did something that, on the surface, sounds very responsible. They created these expert post-war assessment groups. They brought in brilliant minds from the State Department, USAID, intelligence agencies. But here is the problem. These experts actually did their jobs too well. They looked at the reality on the ground and predicted total chaos. They foresaw the electrical grids failing, massive civil disorder, rampant looting, and complete institutional collapse. So faced with this stark, objective truth from their own experts, what did the architects of the war do? Did they slow down? Did they adjust their plans? No. They aggressively walled off and isolated these working groups from the actual decision-makers. What's truly staggering about this is the sheer physical reality of the denial. These incredibly knowledgeable experts were literally banned from the room. They were locked out of meetings with the higher-ups. If a leader accidentally stumbled into one of these assessment meetings, they were actually chastised for it. The planners of the war had reached a point where they viewed objective knowledge, the messy, unavoidable reality of a post-war country, as a direct threat to the momentum of the invasion itself. Just like the managers at NASA, they systematically blinded themselves to protect their grand narrative. They consciously chose the sleek illusion of a
clean, heroic, perfectly executed intervention over the incredibly complex, bloody reality that was being predicted right in front of them by their own people.
Section 4. Weaponizing State History.
And this brings us to what might be the ultimate, most deeply pervasive form of macro deception we're going to cover in this explainer: how entire nation-states actively weaponize and rewrite their own history. This is where those initial conscious lies and cover-ups harden into a permanent, unconscious psychological armor for millions of people. Trivers calls this the construction of the false historical narrative, and it functions as a vital, absolutely necessary survival mechanism for a state's prestige. Think about how this works. A state takes its history and systematically erases the uncomfortable, brutal realities in order to protect group cohesion. It strips away objective, nuanced history and replaces it with uplifting, simplified, patriotic myths. And most dangerously, this newly sanitized history is then weaponized to justify current and future aggressive actions against other nations or groups. Over generations, this completely ceases to be mere propaganda. It evolves. It becomes deep, unconscious self-deception at the societal level. The people inside the system truly, deeply believe the spotless narrative of their ancestors.
Trivers highlights several incredibly stark historical examples of this mechanism playing out in the real world. Take the ongoing textbook battles in Japan, for instance. The historical reality, which is extensively documented, shows that during the Battle of Okinawa in World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army actively induced mass suicides among the civilian population. They even went so far as distributing the grenades to the civilians themselves. Yet the institutional narrative of the state went to absolute war against this reality. The government has repeatedly attempted to mandate new educational guidelines that forcefully delete all references to the Army's involvement in those tragic suicides from school textbooks. They are literally attempting to legislate a painful, historical reality completely out of existence, all to maintain a pristine, honorable image of their military past.
Similarly, Trivers points to the historical denial by the state of Turkey regarding the Armenian genocide. This is an example of a massive, state-enforced suppression of historical facts that has been rigidly maintained for nearly a century. Why? Because accepting a true historical narrative would force a massive reckoning. It would likely lead to calls for reparations, and more importantly, it would fundamentally and forever alter the state's heroic self-concept. Therefore, the institution actively, aggressively refuses to know. It operates out of a raw, evolutionary reflex to protect its survival prestige and its image at all costs, regardless of the historical truth.
Section 5. The Ultimate Cost. From the suffocating, immediate tension of a freezing airplane cockpit to the quiet, highly procedural conference rooms of our most elite space agencies, to the absolute highest echelons of global military power and state education, the underlying mechanism is exactly the same. Self-deception is an offensive strategy. But as we've seen, as this blind spot escalates and scales up from a micro team of 2 people to entire nation-states of millions, it carries a devastating, compounding toll on human life and human progress. Which leaves us here. It leaves us staring quietly into the mirror, looking closely at the bureaucracies, the companies, and the institutions that we all inhabit every single day. If the world's most resourced elite organizations are biologically and structurally engineered to aggressively protect their prestige, even if it means systematically destroying the truth, we have to ask ourselves a very hard question. What vital, uncomfortable truths is your organization actively refusing to see?